when Grant tried to say undirected the number of masters games, but in the crowd is like, actually, you didn't help us at all, buddy. I talked to you afterwards, he's like, yeah, well, I think I didn't take the credit for it.
I was more amused.
Well, his point was that they didn't. Right. So he's very happy for us to get in. Okay, I gather you're good to go. All righty, folks. Oh, sorry, it's okay. That's all right. All right, well, look, first of all, thank you very much for coming along, folks. I think as the election campaign and the year progresses, it becomes increasingly clear that New Zealand has a serious economic challenge that whoever is the next government will need a clear plan to overcome and manage. The simple fact is that after 6 years of Grant Robertson's budgets, there's no gas left in the tank. The cupboard is bare, he's spent it all, and yet people are extremely unsatisfied with the quality of services that they're receiving, the amount of inflationary costs that they confront, the amount of tax that they receive, and also the amount of debt that the government has taken on. It's difficult to imagine how they could have got worse in every dimension of fiscal management. This leaves the next government with very few dimensions in which to manoeuvre. However, ACT believes that as an opposition party we should be not only opposing those negatives but also proposing a way out and a way that is realistic and honest. We have taken the numbers from the pre-election fiscal update, taken Labor's planned spending track over the coming 4 years and adapted those numbers for a new approach that ends government waste by $25.5 billion, reduces taxes by $16 billion and increases expenditure in 5 key areas by $12.2 billion, each of those figures being over 4 years. Because there is around about $7 billion of allowances for new spending in current budgets, that allows us to achieve all of those things and reduce the overall amount of deficit spending, which has the effect of making fiscal impulse negative and reducing the inflationary pressure that households are feeling up and down the country. The tax cuts available under ACT's alternative budget are dramatically smaller than we have promised in the past, but we believe they are the greatest that anybody can honestly promise. They leave the average earner a couple of $100 and then a few more better off each of the 4 years. That is not a large amount of money, but it does make the point that every single household or earner will be better off under this budget than they are right now, while key services receive more investment and while debt is reduced faster than under Labor. The areas where we would invest more money are 5. One of them is local government infrastructure, with just over $1 billion a year given to councils to the extent they allow development in their jurisdiction. If Auckland Council, for example, allows a building to go ahead, then the GST government collects on the construction of that building. Half of it goes to Auckland Council, giving them the means and the incentive to carry on consenting new building, because we need to build. We have a shortage of housing in every city in this country. We would also increase GP capitation by 13%. GPs are an absolutely critical part of the medical infrastructure, which have become a pinch point for the whole system. More people showing up at A&E because they can't get into their GP is bad for everybody, and that's why we would increase GP funding by around $160 million a year, or 13% above baselines. We still have a serious challenge with attracting and retaining teachers as investment in the next generation. That's why we would continue our teaching reward funds of $250 million a year, or approximately $4,500 per teacher, to be distributed by principals in accordance with their school's priority for the types of teachers and performance that they value within their school. We would also increase expenditure in defence to 1.5% of GDP by 2027, aiming to achieve 2% of GDP in 2030. This is essential because Australia will be at 2.3% by 2030. New Zealand, currently at 1%, is not pulling its weight in an ANZAC defence alliance. And sadly, as the geopolitical situation deteriorates, as it has over the past few years, New Zealand needs to start pulling its weight. Finally, we allow for additional expenditure in corrections because it's our view that letting people out of prison the way Labor has, and recently abandoned that target, I might note, has actually led to less safe streets, more police time used up catching and imprisoning the same people over and over again. Our increase in prison capacity and our creation of 200 youth places within corrections separate from adult prisons is absolutely essential so that there is a consequence at the end of the chain that makes criminals respect the rights of everyday New Zealanders. Of course, that $25.5 billion of reduced expenditure will be of concern to some people, particularly those currently receiving the money. We accept that, but we also believe that this country is in a place where it cannot carry on the way that it currently is. You take, for example, something like fees-free tertiary education. Hundreds of millions of dollars a year, around $2 billion so far over the life of the program, and yet we have not seen an increase in students continuing to tertiary education or an improvement in underprivileged or disadvantaged students continuing on to tertiary education. We have to ask the question, is that money being spent effectively, or could New Zealanders spend it themselves, or should we be reducing our debt? Similarly, the First Home Buyers Grant has cost, again, hundreds of millions of dollars per year, but the thing that first home buyers need is for more homes to be built. We would rather be committed to funding infrastructure so more homes get built for all home buyers than trying to give a small group of people a leg up in the housing market when actually the only effect of subsidising some buyers is to increase aggregate demand and increase prices so it actually doesn't leave anybody better off. We also propose to raise the age of entitlement of national superannuation by 3 months per year until it reaches the age of 67. That means that in 8 years' time, by the early 2030s, entitlement to national super would be at 67, but you could still access your KiwiSaver earlier if you would like. I know that people will try and make political capital out of this, and people will say that it's a real problem. I think we have to be honest and say we're in a hole. Australia, Germany, Britain, America, Taiwan, Spain, Italy, Israel, all of these countries are raising their ages of retirement to at or above 67. New Zealand is not the country amongst that group that is so much wealthier that it can afford to keep doing this. In fact, actually, we're poorer. So altogether, you have a budget that is honest about our predicament, that takes the steps required, that may have to be taken on by any government that wins this election anyway, because it is based on the underlying forces that there is too much spending, too much debt, too much pressure on households, and not enough satisfaction with key services such as infrastructure, housing and GPs, not enough long-term investment in corrections and defence for New Zealanders to have the standards of living that they would like to have. happy to take any questions, and I hope it's a useful contribution.
Act once advocated for a flat tax rate, then it went to 2 tiers, now this is 3 tiers. Is Act still a party of low tax?
We absolutely would love the taxes to be much lower, but unfortunately, after 6 years of Grant Robertson, the amount of spending expectation that is built into government and the amount of inefficiency means that we can't get to the flat tax rate that was fiscally possible 6 years ago, or even the 2-rate tax system that was just possible under the budget numbers. Every time we get a fiscal update under Grant Robertson, the circumstances are worse. So what we do propose is to have a 17.5% tax rate up to $60,000, a low and middle income tax offset for low earners so that they get additional money, a 30-cent rate from $60,000 up to $180,000, and a 33-cent rate thereafter. So every tax rate will eventually be lower, with the exception of the bottom rate, which is compensated by that low and middle income tax offset. The net result is a lower, flatter, simpler tax system, but you're right, not as low as ACT would prefer.
How much influence should a minor party have when it comes to fiscal policy around the negotiating table?
Well, I think the negotiation is going to be with fiscal reality, and ACT is putting out a robust plan that I suspect will become reality regardless of politics, because the numbers have to add up. These numbers do add up, and without numbers that add up, the whole country is in big trouble.
Is on the raising of the retirement age, are you going to make allowances for the fact that Māori die on average 7 years younger? And if not, then what are you going to do in very quick succession to make that no longer a thing, so that the retirement age is actually fair for all New Zealanders?
Well, we don't believe in racially categorising New Zealanders. There are non-Māori who will live to a ripe old age, and Māori who will live to a ripe old age. There are Māori who will die young and non-Māori who will die young. Our view is that we should be focused on the key drivers of health rather than lazily and divisively grouping people into ethnicities. Yes, it's true, there are lots of battles to be fought to get better healthcare, better welfare, better housing, better education. All of those things need to be better so we live longer, happier, healthier lives. But we're not going to get into making retirement about race.
But do you accept then that the retirement age would actually be unfair until those health inequities have been sorted?
Well, it's unfair so long as people live different lengths of time. Having one retirement age is inherently unfair, but every country has one.
And that's pretty unfair for people dying earlier on average, though. Like, wouldn't they look at that and be like, that's pretty unfair for me?
I totally agree, and a good reason to look after your health and live a longer, happier, healthier life is that you will get more life and get more enjoyment out of it, and you will get to receive national super for a longer period of time. In fact, it's because people are living longer lives and having fewer children for that matter, that it's become necessary to raise the age of entitlement. Every country is doing this. Most of Europe, the United States, Australia, they're all doing it because they recognise that people are living longer and having fewer kids. New Zealand is not the country amongst that group that is in a position to ignore fiscal reality and maintain a head-in-the-sand stance around superannuation.
You've actually brought that forward, right? You've actually brought that forward, right? Because
it was previously 2 months, and we've made it 3, and that reflects the fact that we've sat down with these numbers, and I can tell you it is tough to balance a budget with the circumstances that Grant Robertson is leaving this country in.
So just on the numbers adding up, you've included the current tax year in the spending cuts, and a lot of that spending would have already happened if you were to get into government. Was that an error?
No, and look, there's always been in this exercise an element of the hypothetical. It's an alternative budget because it's the budget we would have if we were in government. Obviously, if the people decide to elect an ACT national government, and I hope they will, we will face a slightly different set of circumstances because we won't actually have been setting a budget for the 23-24 financial year. Nonetheless, this gives you a good indication of our thinking.
Essentially, the numbers in there don't add up.
Well, yes, they do.
The spendings would have already occurred. So how could they add up?
Well, they add up, because this is hypothetically what we would have done had we been in power. I mean, if we've been releasing these alternative budgets every year for the best part of a decade, if you want to start questioning whether the alternative budget's a useful exercise, well, that's another story. However, obviously, if you're going to have an opposition, they have to propose policies that they would put in place, even though they're actually the opposition. And then if they do get elected by the voters, then the situation they face will be slightly different. But that's quite... Basically, because the best numbers that we have are the 4-year period that come out in the BFU. So I understand what you're saying, but in fairness, this is an exercise in how act in government would set different priorities, and you can understand that that requires a slightly hypothetical approach. But it's very unfair of you to say that means it doesn't add up.
This plan confirms that you would get rid of the school lunches program. Teachers and principals that we've spoken to have said it's a game changer. Getting rid of it would have a negative effect on children. Are you being cruel by taking that away?
No, we're not. We've looked at what Treasury says. Did it actually get more kids coming to school and better engaged in education? If it did, I'd be all for it. Sadly, it does not do that, and so we have to think carefully about, for the taxpayer money we're spending, is that actually getting us to a better place? In the case of free school lunches, very popular with Labor, maybe popular with some people who are fans of the program, but the overall analysis from the point of view of taxpayers and citizens is that it hasn't been a good use of money.
Do charter schools have an element of free meals built into their methodology?
No, they don't. They never received. They receive bulk funding at the same rate as any other school.
So they never provide food for students in the
Oh,
charter
some of them use the flexibility of their funding to do that, and I think
that's because they think it's a good idea, because they won't get fed at some point during the day otherwise, right?
well, they certainly may have had that view, but that doesn't mean that the answer is to spend more money. It's actually to give schools more flexibility to use the funds that they have in order to achieve the goals that that particular school leader thinks. Now, if schools want to do that, then we're actually going to be their best friend. We're just saying that putting extra money into it hasn't actually paid off from the point of view that we've got limited funds and we've got to get benefits.
Why not just try and improve the program like Matt's proposing, rather than just getting rid of it altogether?
I think because you've got to have a clear idea of how it could be improved and would be better off. I know that there are people out there who believe that the government should try and do everything possible, regardless of whether the costs and the benefits stack up. In this instance, Treasury's been very clear that as far as getting kids to school and engaged in learning, doesn't do that, and therefore we don't think it's a good use of money.
You say that now's not the time for significant tax cuts. How would you describe National's tax cuts?
Well, I've said all along, I don't think that they're particularly significant. I mean, I think that they're cutting about 14 billion, if memory serves. Ours are about 16 billion, so I guess ours would be slightly more significant in that sense. But in reality, you've got a good $130 billion a year of tax, and we're talking about $4 billion a year on average of reduction. That's not significant. That's barely keeping up with inflation.
And in terms of that first 48, for people who earn 48,000 or under, do those offset the tax cuts?
Yeah.
Does that even out? Will they be paying more tax, the same tax?
They'll be better off. We've calculated for every earner, for each $1,000 possible income, we've shown that at the minimum, people are $238 better off per year. So everyone is better off. It's not much. We're not selling it as being a big tax cut because we don't think that that's responsible or realistic. We've got to deal to debt and deficiencies in public services that people feel. However, that's where we're at.
So just how does the offsetting work? Is it...
So the low and middle income tax offset, basically you start off, if you earn $0, then you don't receive it. As you earn more, you eventually receive about $950 a year, and once you get to $48,000, it starts to tail off. So it makes up for the fact that you're paying more on your first $14,000. So low-income earners, they get the low and middle income tax offset, so they're better off as a result of that. High-income earners benefit from dropping the top tax rates down from 30 cents between 48 grand and 60 grand down to 17.5. So everybody is better off. But critically, what changes is that if you are earning, $200,000, then you will pay that 17.5 on your first 14,000. Far better to give poorer earners or people with lower incomes a tax credit for those first few $1,000s rather than give everybody a low tax rate when they don't need it.
What is your clear position on whether you are prepared to be in some form of governing arrangement with New Zealand First? And part of that, I put to you the arrangement that you had with Labour, New Zealand First and the Greens, where in that model, ACT and New Zealand First would not have any direct agreements or deal with each other. They would both be with National. What is your position on actually forming some sort of a governing arrangement that has New Zealand First in it?
Well, we've been very clear and consistent. We don't want to work with New Zealand First. I don't think anybody can. Obviously, if it's the difference between having a change of government or not, then we'll find an arrangement, but it'll be as distant as possible. And what exactly that looks like remains to be seen. However, in my view, I think more and more people are going to start to figure out that they're under 5% in a lot of polls. It might be a wasted vote and it's too much to risk.
Christopher Luxon's made the point that he has a good relationship with you and he's spoken with you often. Can you elaborate on those conversations, what Christopher Luxon's position has been in terms of how New Zealand First might factor in with that?
Well, I'm not going to break his confidence. He can speak for himself, but I think it's...
Put it to you that if push comes to shove, he'll do a deal with New Zealand First? No, I've never received that proposition.
New Zealand is no longer in recession and may never have been. Are you popping open the bubbles?
Look, I think the real driver of economic growth at the moment is immigration. We've got 1% economic growth and 2% population increase, 100,000 over 5 million, then unfortunately, as individuals, we're actually worse off. You see, you don't make individuals wealthier by adding more people at the same level of wealth. In fact, we're going backwards in that sense. So no, it's productivity growth that we need. ACT's in favour of immigration. We think immigration is important for the productivity and competitiveness of New Zealand firms. We think we're a nation of immigrants. We're not anti-immigration, but we also believe that you can't take immigration growing the population and confuse that with actual productivity growth because it's not the same thing.
Do you agree with Grant Robertson when he says the economy is turning the corner?
I'd like to hope that that's the case, but the truth is that productivity growth is still absolutely in the tank. The quality of public services is bad. The quality of regulations is bad. So if that is happening, it can't be anything that Labor have done. If we want real fixes for the economy, it's going to take brave policy changes to make New Zealand more productive.
So Labor get all the blame but no credit?
Well, let's look at what they've done in terms of their policies. Those are not things you would expect to improve economic performance.
On the alternative budget, you've got privatising land owned by Landcorp, and it's about 300,000 hectares, obviously quite a significant chunk. What's your reasoning behind that?
Look, right across the government sector, what we've found is that if you partially privatise corporations and allow private shareholders to own a part of them, if they have it listed on the NZX, one of the things that you immediately find is that the government is that the company is much more accountable if it has private shareholders along with ministers. Because if you have a minister as your only possible shareholder, you could have Willie Jackson responsible for a huge company, much better that they're reporting to the NZX. That's what raises productivity.
But you've mentioned it's privatising all of the land, like selling off all the land.
Well, equally, I mean, I'd put it back to you. What's the justification in 2023 for the government owning farms? Now, if somebody can propose what that is, I'd be very interested to know. But owning farms is a risky business. It's best done by people who are prepared to put their own funds on the line and work hard to make it work. There's no point in someone being a shareholder in farms just because they got made the shareholding minister in cabinet. That's not the right person to have that interest.
And Winston Peters, is it time that Luxon comes to them and tells the public, what his position is on working with.
Oh, look, I think Chris has got his own race to run. I'm not going to tell him what sort of declarations he should make. My position's very clear. We're talking about someone here who has fallen out with and failed to cooperate with everybody he's ever tried to work with. This country requires real change and actually some competent economic management. If you throw New Zealand First in the middle of that, it will be disastrous. And that's not me talking, that's everyone that's ever tried to work with them before. It's just basic history.
You're both essentially just saying that you will work with them if you need to.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is I respect the voters and that a parliament will be elected, and Chris likes sort of able to try and form a government, but our strong preference is that it's ACT and National working together to put in place a plan to fix this economy. The alternative is that you're going to spend 3 years trying to manage somebody whose track record is that they've resigned, been voted out of parliament, been censured, I mean you name it, they've had the problems, and I don't think that New Zealand is at a point where it needs somebody who's had so many chances to fix all of the things that they currently complain about and doesn't seem to have ever quite done it. I don't see why they deserve another chance at cost to everyone else in New Zealand. Sorry, yeah, Jamie, yeah.
Question. Do you think it's fair for Labour to be kind of boasting or saying how the economy is turning a corner, GDP is going up, inflation is coming down, when in the past they're trying to distance themselves whenever those numbers have looked fresh?
I think it's really important that politicians are honest about the things they can control and can't control. We can affect the regulation and the quality of spending by government. I would judge Labor have done a poor job at that, and they should not be taking the credit for what are really minor upticks in the economy driven by inflation. Because if you start going down that track, next thing Chris Hipkins will be taking credit for the sun coming up tomorrow.
What are the key things you've cut out of this budget?
There's a series of things, but they come in groups. We don't believe in corporate welfare. We don't believe in governments giving money to businesses that they've taxed off other businesses. We don't believe in middle-class welfare, for example. We don't think fees free has been effective at getting better education for New Zealand. It just creates extra debt. The same people who benefit will have to pay off in the future anyway. And we don't believe that there should be what we term demographic ministries, ethnic affairs, women, Pacific peoples, TPK. These are ministries who's entirely focused on an identity of person, when what New Zealand needs is to be united around public services that serve each person to the best of their ability on their terms without fear or favour.
Can I just ask you actually about that? What do you expect if they were to be abolished? The outcomes would be, for example, Office of Crown Māori Relations exists due to legislated treaty settlements. Do you have a concern that abolishing that department might open up a new wave of treaty settlements?
No, I mean, look, the treaty settlement process is something that we have stood behind. I understand that ACT has voted for every treaty settlement process during its existence since 1996, and so we're very careful that the changes we're making would not affect the treaty settlement process.
And on Ministry for Women, part of their work is closing the gap, the gender pay gap. Where do you think that work would move to, or what would you think would happen to that?
Look, I think that it's an important task, but I don't think you require an entire ministry to do it. Obviously, you would hope that MB, if they were responsible for employment law, for example, or if they were responsible for appointments on government boards, that you would be making sure that you treated all people equally and equally well, and that you were aware of any historic differences that you wanted to compensate for. I just don't think that you need an entire department to do that.
And would that be with the Ministry of Ethnic Communities, one of the recommendations in the Royal Commission into March 15? Did you disagree with some of those recommendations that ethnic minorities have been often ignored by the government?
Well, I look at, for example, one of the findings was that the intelligence agencies weren't correctly focused on where the terrorism threat might come from. But we don't need to do create a whole new government department to tell the security agencies that they should be properly focusing on detecting terrorist threats and attacking the right causes of risk. Again, you know, these departments, they exist to do things that I can explain to you in a sentence. I don't think we need entire departments which collectively cost hundreds of millions of dollars to achieve that.
Abolishing school lunches, as far as I can see, it wasn't in your previous alternative budget. What happened over the last 6 weeks?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Our previous alternative budget would have kept it. That Treasury advice changed our mind. I was surprised by that analysis because I'd heard the same feedback you had. But at the end of the day, if you crunch the numbers and it doesn't add up, then you shouldn't keep doing it. We're not at a stage where we can continue to borrow, spend and hope. We've had 6 years of that, and it's now got us to the point where we've got to make much harder choices than we'd otherwise like to.
So you haven't added it in just because you needed an extra few dollars?
No, because we've seen analysis that suggested, look, and like I say, if it was getting more kids to school and focused on learning better, look, that's probably one of the most important things we can do in this country right now. But as it turns out, it's not.
You probably remember back in 2017, one of the sentiments that the Greens and New Zealand First used to say is that they weren't in agreement with each other, they were in agreement with Labour. If on election day that is to happen again with UN National and New Zealand First National, would that make it quite a bittersweet election for you? You know what? I don't think there's a lot of evidence that that hypothetical is going to come about. So if it happens, we'll deal with it. But frankly, I think some people's fixation has gone a little bit beyond where it needs to be.
How are you feeling about the debate tonight?
Oh, look, I love debates. I think that they're a good opportunity for New Zealanders to see what's on offer from different parties. And so I'm looking forward to tonight.
Are you expecting any run-ins with institutes?
No, I'll be talking to New Zealanders who are concerned about the economy and the effects of government policy on race relations as well as crime, and those are the things that I'll be talking about to the people who can vote ACT. I'm pretty sure that Mr Peters is not going to vote ACT, so I probably won't be talking to him so much. Then again, he might, you know.
What qualities do you think make a trustworthy political leader?
Look, I think it's somebody who listens to and actually hears voters' concerns. It's someone who not only hears voters' concerns but also comes up with their own credible, constructive alternatives and then does their best to promote those so people have real choice at the election.
Why are you trustworthy?
Well, it's ultimately for other people to judge if I or any other politician are trustworthy. But here's the second day in a row that we've been out putting up policy that responds directly to concerns we hear from real people. That's the job of a politician. Listen, propose, implement if given the chance by the voters. I just keep doing that, and if that makes me more trustworthy, then I'm very grateful for that trust.
Do you think the public trusts you?
Well, I certainly hope that they do. I've worked hard in my job to be a good member of Parliament, a good local MP in Epsom, and to lead a party that is constructive and makes proposals as well as opposing policy. So I hope that we're in a good space there.
Just in your alternative budget, there's a line, additional cost savings. Do you know what I'm referring to? Yeah. Can you explain what those are? There's about 5.6 billion in first year, 6.4 in the next 6.8.
Well, let me, if you're going to run through them one by one.
Yeah, well, just it doesn't say specifically what they are. So
yeah.
Can you explain?
Yeah. So the main thing, well, actually, it's simple. The main part of it is actually the operating allowances that the current government has put in place that we would continue to, well, we have, they're there, we have to accept them. We would be using that money to fund the services, the reductions in tax and the reductions of debt that we have, and that's how you get from your starting point, which is, what are we, 25.5 billion of cost reduction, 16 billion of tax cuts and 12.2 billion of additional spending. Obviously the other two add to just over 28 and you're only saving 25.5 in cost reductions, so therefore using that additional allowance of about 6 billion over 4 years allows you to end up with a better overall operating balance than you would have otherwise had. That makes sense? Thanks. All right. Well, look, folks, I've got to actually get to an interview at 2:30, so unless there's... Oh,
You've missed it.
yeah, okay. I did have to get to an interview at 2:30, but it seems that that's a special kind of deficit that I have to make up as well. So thank you very much.